landscape has always occupied a special place in the southern heart. Broad winding rivers, majestic forests, and fertile marshes provide us with food and shelter, employment and recreation, and satisfy a deeper need for natural beauty and a sense of place. Here at Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge, the chapters in our long relationship with this land can be read in our varied habitats and in the wealth of plants and wildlife. There are stories of cooperation, of success, and of a bright future. Many stories are still being written as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages these habitats to support migratory birds and endangered species. Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge was created with the assistance of local people who wanted a refuge for waterfowl that offered abundant wildlife and lush scenery. That bond remains strong today. The refuge is located 5 miles north of historic Eufaula, Alabama on Highway 165, just 1.5 miles off U.S. Highway 431. The refuge offers local citizens and other visitors opportunities to come face to face with our natural world and to be part of the continuing story of this southern landscape. Long before the first European settlers came to the area, the Chattahoochee Valley was home to the Muskogee Creek Indians. Then, old-growth forests covered the land, and creek villages were scattered along the riverbanks. Today, the landscape you'll see around you is very different. The old hardwood stands are gone, and the waters of Lake Walter F. George, also known as Lake Eufaula, cover much of the land where the Indians lived and hunted. What caused those changes is part of our story here at Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge. In the early 1800s, settlers moved into the area. A prosperous town soon developed as a trading center and a port for steamboats plying the Chattahoochee River. First named Irwinton after its founder, the town was later called Eufaula, after one of the Indian tribes in the area. As the town grew, more and more cropland was needed, so old-growth forests were cleared until very little was left. After World War II, when agriculture declined, commercial pine forests were planted in the fields. The landscape changed again. Through all these changes, the wildlife that had used these lands was forced to adjust. The winter habitat used by waterfowl was reduced, and for tiny migratory songbirds, it became harder and harder to find the forests their species had always used as resting and feeding stations on their long route to and from Central and South America. Then, in 1963, the Army Corps of Engineers impounded part of the Chattahoochee River for navigation and stream flow control, creating Lake Eufaula. Held back by the Walter F. George Lock and Dam, the waters of the Chattahoochee are now used for recreation and power generation. In the 1960s, the words of Theodore Roosevelt, founding father of the National Refuge System, began to ring truer and truer for concerned citizens in the Chattahoochee Valley. As the work on Lake Eufaula progressed, an effort grew from a community desire to dedicate some land for wildlife. In 1964, the Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge opened. Today, the refuge covers over 11,000 acres of varied and vital habitats. One of about 600 refuges throughout the country, Eufaula shares their goals. The mission of the National Wildlife Refuge System is to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of the fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats within the United States for the benefit of present and future generations of Americans. Throughout the year, an amazing variety of animals and birds use the refuge as either a temporary or permanent home. Nearly 300 species of birds can be seen here, making it a paradise for bird watchers and nature photographers. 2 observation decks are located along the 7-mile Wildlife Drive, providing views over fields and wetlands. In late fall and winter, the refuge is crowded with many species of waterfowl and wading birds, which have flown south for the winter. As many as 15,000 waterfowl may join the herons and geese feeding in the impoundments, making for lively birdwatching. Many varieties of ducks can be seen diving and dipping for plants and small aquatic creatures. While waterfowl are here, the 7-mile Wildlife Drive is reduced to 5 miles to create areas for sanctuary. But there are still plenty of viewing places. From November until January, waterfowl hunting is allowed in designated areas of the refuge on certain days and only by permit. At this time of year, if you're lucky, you might also see some stately sandhill cranes, or hawks, osprey, and eagles on the refuge. By late winter, most of our bird visitors are leaving for their summer habitats in the north. But the coming of spring starts a frenzy of nest building among our resident birds. Great blue herons, great egrets, and other water birds begin to work in their communal rookeries in the refuge's wetlands. Early spring water levels in the wetlands are carefully managed to provide the best feeding conditions for wading birds and shore birds. Wood ducks are also beginning to nest, but they use special boxes provided for them. These colorful birds were greatly reduced in number because of their unusual nesting habits. Unlike other ducks which nest on the ground, wood ducks prefer holes in old trees. Very few old trees remain in their nesting areas, so the wood ducks were severely reduced until the nesting box program was started. The wood ducks have taken to their constructed homes like, well, ducks to water. This is one story with a happy ending. By mid-spring, the refuge is alive with bird songs as the neotropical migrants pass through. These tuneful birds travel amazing distances each spring and fall, flying from as far north as Canada, where they nest, to as far south as South America, where they winter. This story is one that, so far, does not have a very happy ending. Habitat changes in the U.S. and deforestation in Central and South America is causing a continuing decline in songbird numbers. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuges provide resting and feeding stops for the migrants. We're forging international partnerships to secure the future of these species. Late spring heralds the arrival of one of our most curious-looking but welcome summer visitors, wood storks. Wood stork numbers have dropped because of habitat loss. They are now on the federal endangered species list. Wood storks have not nested in Alabama in years, but Eufaula Refuge is working to change that by trying to create optimum habitat. This story is still being written. We hope the final chapter includes nests filled with noisy chicks. Even in the heat of late summer, the refuge hosts migrating birds, such as blue-winged teal, and offers opportunities to see our resident birds and summer visitors feeding in the shallow waters. One prominent species shows how well cooperative efforts can work. It is the bald eagle. There are several nests in the area, and eagles can be seen fishing over the lake through the year. Only a few years ago, our national symbol was on the verge of extinction because the pesticide DDT had entered the food chain, creating eggs too fragile to hatch. A concerted nationwide effort to save the bald eagle has been successful. Our refuge staff monitors the progress of our local eagles in collaboration with other agencies. Young eagles are released periodically in cooperation with Auburn University's Southeastern Raptor Rehabilitation Center. Although Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge is known best for its birds, it's also home to a wide variety of reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and fish. On some days, you might think the refuge is alligator central. Numerous alligators live and nest on the refuge, Their very numbers tell another conservation success story. Hunted almost to extinction for their valuable hides, alligators are now back in such numbers that their status has been reduced from endangered to threatened. Please remember to observe these animals from a distance and do not feed them. The refuge is also home to a number of snakes, including some poisonous varieties. Mammals are harder to spot because many are active at night and they tend to be secretive. 49 species live on the refuge, including raccoons, armadillos, otters, beaver, and of course, deer. The population of deer is large and must be controlled by hunting, including some specially organized youth hunts. Permits must be obtained for all hunting. The refuge's 4,000 acres of open water and wetlands also make it a very popular fishing destination. Bass, brim, crappie, and catfish can be caught here, but the big draw is the largemouth bass. On Eufaula Refuge, fishing is allowed throughout the year with the appropriate license. Wildlife comes first at Eufaula, as it does at all national wildlife refuges. That commitment makes each refuge an anchor for biodiversity, ensuring that as many species as possible survive and flourish. A vital part of that work is maintaining healthy wildlife habitats. Here at the refuge, we have several types of habitat that are actively managed for the benefit of wildlife. In the early 1960s, when the refuge was created, most of its acreage was poorly managed forest or agricultural land. Over the years, time, effort, and funding have been invested in improving these habitats. Now, there are about 2,200 acres of woodlands, mainly pines and hardwoods. Controlled burns are used to manage the pine forests, but always with wildlife, not economic, goals in mind. The woodlands now host neotropical migrant birds as well as resident mammals, hawks, and owls. On 1,100 acres, farming continues, but with guidelines designed to benefit wildlife. The private farmers who lease the fields are required to leave a portion of the crops for wildlife. They are also monitored for correct chemical, crop rotation, and soil conservation practices. As a result, the croplands are a haven for a wide variety of species including deer, sandhill cranes, and waterfowl. Several hundred acres of former croplands are being maintained with briars, vines, and young trees. This vegetation provides cover for many mammals and birds and shelters them during cold weather. The ditch banks and field edges serve as transition zones between major habitats. Predators such as hawks, owls, foxes, and bobcat thrive in these habitats. About 75 acres of grasslands are managed for hay. As with the old fields, the growing grass provides cover and food for many animals. The bulk of the refuge is dedicated to wetland habitats. There are 4,000 acres of open water in the rivers, creeks, and impoundments, and nearly 3,000 acres of marshland. These areas are home to a wide variety of fish. They provide feeding grounds for wading birds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. The water levels in the impoundments and some marshlands are managed during the year to create the right habitat for birds to feed, rest, and nest. Each spring, the water is drained, thus encouraging native plants to grow, which provide valuable foods for waterfowl. Each fall, water is replenished in time for arriving waterfowl. Management also involves controlling exotic plant species and other undesirable invasive vegetation. Although so much hard work goes on behind the scenes to make this a good place for wildlife, Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge is also a good place for people. Created by the community, it still plays an important role in the life of wildlife lovers from near and far. Visitors are a vital part of our mission. Whether you come to watch the birds or to landscape has always occupied a special place in the southern heart. Broad winding rivers, majestic forests, and fertile marshes provide us with food and shelter, employment and recreation, and satisfy a deeper need for natural beauty and a sense of place. Here at Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge, the chapters in our long relationship with this land can be read in our varied habitats and in the wealth of plants and wildlife. There are stories of cooperation, of success, and of a bright future. Many stories are still being written as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages these habitats. 1. The refuge offers local citizens and other visitors opportunities to come face to face with our natural world and to be part of the continuing story of this southern landscape. Long before the first European settlers came to the area, the Chattahoochee Valley was home to the Muskogee Creek Indians. To support migratory birds and endangered species. Eufaula National Wildlife Refuge was created with the assistance of local people who wanted a refuge for waterfowl that offered abundant wildlife and lush scenery. That bond remains strong today. The refuge is located 5 miles north of historic Eufaula, Alabama on Highway 165, just 1.5 miles off U.S. Highway 431.